Reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, as we continue on with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And that'll be verses 21 through 37. You've heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not murder. Whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," you'll be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and sister. Then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on your way to court with him. Or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you'll be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you'll never get out until you've paid the last penny. You've heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you, anyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of unchastity causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said of those of ancient times, "You shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows that you've made to the Lord." I say to you, don't swear at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord lives forever. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, I just watched that movie, Ford versus Ferrari. And no spoiler alerts today, don't worry, I won't tell you how it ends, even though if you're a race fan, you probably already know how it ends. Because it tells the story of the Ford versus Ferrari competitions that was the big showcase at the Le Mans race in the 1960s, or Le Mans, if I'm going to say it correctly. And just as the incredible driver Ken Miles did actually experience in the race in that Le Mans at 1966, he experienced in real life, the movie showed him having trouble closing his door on the first lap. That door wouldn't latch. And so that one part of the whole race car, that door, not latching correctly, threw everything off track. And he had an awful first lap. But then he pulled over, or at least in the movie, this is how they resolved it. I'm not totally sure how they resolved it in real life, if this is true. But they pulled into the pits. The guys come out with the sledgehammer, the door shut so it'll stay shut. And then he's able to take off and go. And the rest of the race, he's setting lap records over and over and over again the rest of the race. And really won the race in the end. Technically, not exactly, but I'll let you guys dig into that if you're curious. But ran an amazing race once all those parts were functioning as they were supposed to. One part not functioning faithfully, The whole thing cannot be made what it was made to be. Faithfulness. That's what the scripture is about today from Matthew. As important as each part functioning faithfully, as important as that is for the build of a race car, it's even more important for us. So now today in section 3 or part 3 of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has already given us the blessings and the Beatitudes. Jesus has taught us that we are ourselves the light of the world and the salt of the earth, and we're responsible for shining that light on the world, for delivering God's blessings to fellow human beings. So that's what we've covered so far. Now we're in the 3rd section of the sermon. And here in part 3, Jesus teaches us that when our faithfulness runs short, when we fall short being faithful, we compromise our ability to be the light and the salt that we were made to be. He says, you've heard, don't murder. I say, don't be angry. Don't talk down to each other. Don't disrespect each other. If you've got a problem with one another, straighten it out before you offer your sacrifice and worship. Otherwise, you're offering a sacrifice that doesn't mean anything. Now, this language was to offer your gift at the altar. So that's sacrifice language, even though we don't know of Christians doing like animal sacrifices or anything. So I think we're talking about giving like we knew giving in that form of sacrifice. Some folks think that this applies to the communion table. You probably heard it before that you can't, that you shouldn't have communion until you made things right. And that's, some people in traditions will say that that's where this is going, but to me, I hear it more like you need to make things right before you make your offering. Oh, churches don't want to hear that, do we? But at any rate, the stress is on making things right, worshiping with a clean heart. This part, as Jesus is telling us, teaching us, it recalls Isaiah and Micah and others that were preaching against people making meaningless sacrifices. God says, the sacrifice I desire is that you do justice, you love kindness, you walk humbly with your God. I don't care about the animals being sacrificed and worshiped. So we can translate into that. It's not all about the money. What I care is that you are doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God. The point being, even one of us in the church hanging on to anger and conflict, even one of us doing that, it's toxic. It tears the church apart. So Jesus says, be reconciled with your brother or sister. Then come offer your sacrifice, a sacrifice that actually means something. Next, Jesus deals with a couple more hard-hitting issues that we may not really want to hear. All right, Jesus is, now when these issues come up, he's both addressing these issues themselves of adultery and divorce. But he's also putting them into the bigger picture of the sermon and the message that he's preaching, and that is ultimately how to be church. Now, the adultery lesson in itself is probably the easier of the two to accept, right? Because we can understand, looking at a person with that lust in your heart, that in itself, a wandering eye, that in itself is like an act of betrayal toward the one you love. So, of course, that's like committing adultery in your heart. We may not like the lesson. It's a truth that a lot of us don't want to hear, but it's the truth. We don't love with just our bodies. We love with our minds. We love with our hearts. We love with our souls. We love with all our strength. We love with our whole selves, our whole bodies, and everything in them. The body, it's better off losing an eye, because at least the body can still function. The body is better off losing an eye than it is losing its whole self to sin. And that one unfaithful member of that body, that one unfaithful member can throw the whole thing off. So, we are actually talking about the actual eye of the actual body of the person committing adultery in their heart, but we're also talking about how toxic any one of us can be to the greater church by being unfaithful. Now, the divorce lesson is also something that A lot of us don't want to hear. And now, one in the same way, in some ways it's just hard to accept, going bouncing against stuff that we'd rather do or rather think. But it's also more than that. Because mostly I do totally agree with Jesus' lesson on divorce, and I think the way it's done fits perfectly into the bigger lesson. And especially because he does give that exception. The exception to the rule of when it's okay to divorce is unchastity. What is unchastity? Unchastity is unfaithfulness. It's cheating. In my mind, talking about divorce, though, and thinking about it in real terms and things we experience, people we know, and all this, in my mind, him giving that exception, it has to open the door for some more exceptions, like being abused by your spouse, all right, physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever. Abuse is a justifiable reason for divorce in my book. Of course, abuse is another form of unfaithfulness. So let's stay zeroed in on that unfaithfulness thing, because that's the key to this whole lesson. It's about being faithful. There are obvious reasons that justify a split. But then there are also more complicated issues, like growing apart. Some couples divorce because, as they describe, they grew apart. All right, so what do we do with that? In some cases, it seems like they're better off. Haven't made that decision. It seems like both haven't gone their separate ways. They're happier, and they say they're happier. They're glad that they divorced, and so on. So, who am I to say that was wrong there? But then, at the same time, you also hear about those people who just give great, endless thanks to God for that one person who stepped in and told you to say, you need to step up in your marriage. You need to think more about the other person. You need to not be so selfish. You need to value what you've got. You need to live up to the vows that you made. Work on your marriage. Put some more effort into it. We all have trouble with marriage. It's tough getting going and learn how to live with each other and so forth. So, while on one hand, it seems like maybe there is the growing apart thing. I don't know. On the other hand, this obviously a lot of us just need to work harder. The divorce rate wouldn't be so high. But in the end, this is all about faithfulness, once again. How faithful are we? How faithful are we willing to be? These teachings on adultery and divorce from Jesus, they are difficult. But point taken. Every one of us needs to be faithful to one another. It's just using our marriages is a wonderful example of how devoted we're supposed to be to each other in church and how willing we are supposed to be to work things out and grow together. To be faithful not only on the outside, but also on the inside. Working hard to get our hearts in the right place and never becoming a stumbling block to someone else's faithfulness. How one of us behaves impacts all of us, and it impacts our mission. So finally, Jesus wraps up this section with the part on swearing falsely. Don't go swearing to this or that you'll do something or whatever. I don't know. We've all heard it before. I swear on my grandfather's grave that I'll pay you back, or something like that. We all will swear I'll do something, and then Jesus says, no, don't even swear at all, because you might break that swear. All right, just let your answers be simple. Yes, yes, no, no. Simply tell the truth. Do what you can with what you have. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. Don't make false promises. Don't go trying to make yourself look like anything more than you are. If you make a vow, a promise, then you fulfill that vow. And be cautious with the vows that you make, because sometimes they're very hard to keep. Life happens. We need to be there for each other, is the bottom line. We need to be putting our whole selves into being there for each other so we can depend on each other. The different parts of this section in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, it's all part 3, where it has these big lessons jumbled together. Don't let our anger, our lust, or our tendency to give up on each other and just split apart. Don't let any of that stuff cause the church to stumble. All that stuff is very normal and natural for us human beings. We have to fight some of these urges. We have to work on this stuff, but don't let any of that stuff be a reason that your church stumbles. Be faithful. Be reasonable. Do your part. And keep in mind that Jesus isn't only teaching us how to be Christians, Jesus is also reminding us that none of us are alone in this journey. We have each other. We have the support we need. The other day we had a big scare with Eddie falling and hitting his head, knocking his noggin pretty good on that concrete. All the prayers swirling around Eddie and the family gives a solid example of faithful church. Set the whole church in motion praying. You should have seen the text messages and phone calls and things going. The possibility of losing just one member set the whole church in motion. Everyone is that important. A faithful church is a church that gets how important every person is. And sadly, yesterday, as we did just lose Dick White. Now, while he wasn't a member of this congregation, or at least recently, he was certainly a part of this church, a close friend of ours, brother of Sherry and Rosie, and also a member of a church, so also part of the church as a whole. When we think of the whole, we should remember that even our congregation is part of the whole. All right, we are not the church by ourselves. We are part of the disciples of Christ. We're part of the whole church with all kinds of folks we may agree with or disagree with or whatever, but we're all in this together. You know, in heaven, Christians aren't divided like we are. There's no Protestant or Catholic. There's no liberal or conservative divide. There's no divide over how to be baptized or how to do communion or who can preach. Throughout this whole section of Jesus' sermon, he's teaching us to be the church on earth as the church is in heaven. And basically, in these verses today, after Jesus has taught us to see the world through God's eyes in the Beatitudes, after he's taught us that we are responsible for shining the light and sharing the salt with all of the world, Jesus is now teaching us not to let any of our nonsense throw the whole thing off track. He's saying, don't be that stupid door on the race car that wouldn't close, ruining that car's ability to drive and keep up with everybody else. If something's wrong, deal with it. Get things working again. And maybe what's wrong with that door hinge is, one of us just hanging on to anger. Maybe it's a wandering eye. Maybe it's, someone who just wants to quit and go do their own thing, go their own direction. Maybe it's not being true to the promises that have been made. It could be any number of things causing that door to swing open when it's supposed to be shut. But once that door latches, we'll be here together and out there in the world setting lap records for the Lord. God is calling us to live faithfully, to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth, and God is with us, Emmanuel, every step of the way, as we are also here for each other. So let us hear Jesus' tough message today, loud and clear. Let us wrestle with it. And may we faithfully do our part as part of the whole body of Christ.